And Kathleen Lee is an instructor here at Humboldt State University in political science. She teaches the politics of the environment. And tonight she's going to give a little presentation that I think is going to give a much broader perspective on the issues that we're facing that will really ground us for what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So Kathleen Lee.
Thanks very much, Larry. We're talking about the future. Of course, the theme that we've got is creating a resilient future. And the future is a very difficult thing to work with because, of course, we don't really know what's happening and we don't really know what's coming up ahead. This picture I have here is one that was brought to mind by the Canadian political scientist Thomas Homer Dixon in his book, The Upside of Down, in which he described where we are today as something similar to driving on a foggy road at night. And here's what he said. Think of the road as the line of time, stretching endlessly from the past behind us into the future in front of us. We live in an instant of fast-forward motion between what has been and what's to come. We don't really give the past much thought, although we may occasionally glimpse bits and pieces. The decades that roll out in front of us are obscure, tries we may to make out the features. The car's headlights are like the best experts in forecasting technologies we can muster, but they penetrate only a short distance into the haze. Even so, and despite those who sense calamity ahead, many people believe they have a pretty good idea of what's coming. They think that things are going to basically work out fine because they're optimistic about the future and our ability to deal with surprises. They see an ever-improving future of broadened and deepened global capitalism, expanded democracy, and a respect for human rights, and marvelous advances in science and technology. All changes that will strengthen our progress towards greater happiness and well-being. So they ignore the fog and keep their foot pressed on the accelerator pedal. And that's, very much where we are right now. Because you can listen to Lester Brown and you can hear him talk about what we could be doing right now. And you have all of these proposals about what we could be doing right now, but then you come to the question of, well, then why aren't we? And that's a little bit of what I want to talk to you tonight. Now, again, dealing with the future is always a challenge because, as physicist Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially when it involves the future. We really don't have any sure idea. We've got a lot of hints, but really trying to figure that out. And as we'll see, making some hard predictions is a very treacherous road to take. Now, basically, human beings are hardwired to the present. That's our main focus. And that probably gave us some evolutionary advantage in the past, but it doesn't really necessarily mean it's to our advantage right now. Holocaust historian Lucy Davidovich said, "We look at the past through the prism of the present and try to discern the future." So the way that we see the future is very much part of the way that we see the present. We sort of cherry pick history to support our view of what we think the future is going to be like. So and I see a couple of my former environmental politics students here, and they'll be familiar with some of the scenarios that we discuss in that course. The first one is called the Jetsons. And this is pretty much the dominant view of the future that we see with policymakers today. And the idea is, business as usual is working just fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If we come into problems, we're going to be able to address them using our marvelous adaptability and technology. This is popular with people who tend to support the status quo because it means that you don't have to change the status quo. So this is a very comfortable position to take. And it really very much is the way that we sort of look at the world. Now, it's based on something that we call the progress paradigm. And the progress paradigm is a social paradigm that sort of explains, how societies work. And basically, you have this idea that we're always moving forward. The dialectic is always going up. It's never going down. And it really comes from the period of the Enlightenment. Because prior to the Enlightenment, we didn't really have this linear upward view of progress and of history. First of all, as Jared Diamond was pointing out, we didn't really know that much about what had transpired before. You might see some ruins out there or something like that, but you didn't really know for sure how things had progressed. But basically, this is a Judeo-Christian view rather than the cyclical view that we see in other faith traditions. And Judeo-Christianity has shaped Western civilization, so it's really important in looking at this to see that that's the way it is. Now, the other thing about the linear view of history is it has an endpoint. So we've always had this idea that we're moving towards some final fulfillment, and that also has some downsides, as we'll see. Now, this was reinforced in the 19th century with Darwinism. Now, Darwinism is not this idea of hierarchy, but it fits so well with Hegel's dialectic of this ever, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, always moving forward to a higher level of development, that we were sort of conditioned to see that we were always on this uphill climb, which we were going to be always constantly improving as we moved up this plane. Now, both capitalism and Marxism bought into the progress paradigm because it fit very well with both philosophies. For the capitalists, I say, freedom of thought and unleashing the power of the market means that things are constantly going to be improving. And it seemed certainly to fit with this upsurge of inventions, the increase in productivity, the increased wealth, scientific exploration. It certainly fit very well with it. Now, Marx offers a critique of the capitalist system, but he doesn't offer a critique of the way that they viewed progress. It just was taking it in a different direction. And the idea that you could achieve social equality was based on technology. And it was based on the exploitation of resources. Mao's, if you look at these posters from China during the Cultural Revolution that says, move the mountains and make progress happen. So it certainly wasn't this idea that there were any sorts of limits. And the only real difference was, yes, nature should be exploited, but it should be exploited for the benefit of all and not just for the benefit of the few. Now, the 20th century really puts this into hyperdrive because of the increase in technology, because of our ability to exploit energy sources, and we're sort of defined as more, bigger, better, faster. The more you can get, the faster you can do it, the more you can increase efficiency. You've got lots of things that are now available for lower cost, and after World War II, where we'd had this big transition towards producing war materials, we needed to keep people employed afterwards, and so there was this big push of advertising. I mean, advertising had been there prior to World War II, but it really took off with the invention of television, with this idea that you needed those appliances, and you needed that car, and you needed those cigarettes, and you needed TV dinners, and you needed all of these things so that you really became a much more consumer-oriented society, and to the point now that we have a society where 70% of our economy depends on consumption, so we have to keep that going to keep our economy going. And you see this, now we see lots of graphs today that they call hockey stick graphs, which are, things kind of bump around here for a couple millennia, and then all of a sudden, poof! And we see it with population, we see it with energy use, and here you see it with GDP. And why does this happen? What can explain this, and as we'll see, what it is a wonderful source of energy. that heretofore just simply had not been available that made it possible to do this. Now, the components of the progress paradigm: technology will keep improving, technology will solve all our problems. This sort of sounds like the United Federation of Planets manifesto here. Humanity will overcome war, disease, and poverty, and if we run out of one resource, we'll find another one that'll replace it. We'll get those dilithium crystals. Going backward or becoming less complex is unthinkable. I mean, think of it today. We're in an election year. You know, I'm running for Congress, or I'm running for governor, or, and I say, folks, we really have to scale back. You know, we're really going to have to kind of shrink that GDP. It's not a real winning strategy. And so you really don't see it. We'll see that that's one of the political obstacles that we have. Now, I think it's my earring here that's going against this microphone. High tech, huh? Now, we began to see some dissenters about mid-century. And, you know, with Rachel Carson and Paul Ehrlich and Lester Brown saying, folks, we might want to take a different look at this. We also had a president that sort of gingerly took a step in that direction with Jimmy Carter, giving his speech with a sweater, telling us to turn down the thermostats, which mostly ended up being ridiculed and seen as a mistake on his part. He may go down in history as being rather prescient on that, however. But the results of this pointing out, we got some issues here, folks, was the environmental movement. And during the late 1960s, early 1970s, we had a whole slew of environmental laws that were passed: the Environmental Protection Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, you know, the Toxic Waste Disposal Act. All of those laws were an attempt to deal with the fact that people were pointing out some flaws in this progress paradigm. Policymakers, however, today still persist in this idea of getting the economy growing again. And that really remains. Why does it remain? Because that's the only way you're going to get elected. You're simply, you know, you're not going to be able to win national office by delivering the bad news. So we have, at the same time as they began to point out some flaws in this, some different visions of the future that began to appear too. And part of that, and I want you to appreciate my very high-tech graphics here, the progress paradigm rests on the foundation of available resources. And it rests on the foundation primarily of a wide variety of fossil fuels. And as long as we've got that energy, and as long as we've got those resources, we can keep this growing. But if we deplete the resources, it's a whole new ballgame. And this, of course, is pointed out very early on, in the 1700s, by a British clergyman by the name of Thomas Malthus, who did the calculations based on the food that was being produced in Britain at the time, and said, with our increase in population and our ability to feed ourselves, we're not going to be able to pull this off. We're going to have collapse of this population. But of course, they are able to meet that Malthusian dilemma through the use of energy. You're able to transport food from other areas to Great Britain. Great Britain ceased to be self-sufficient in food in the early 1800s. And they relied on imports, and they've relied on it till then. We can live in climates that would not have supported large populations before. You would not have had a Phoenix before the use of air conditioning. Or you might have a tiny little town where everyone stays inside all day and only goes out in the evening if you had a place like that. So the use of energy allows this to change, but it's really to a point. And it's at that point where we begin to see some of these stresses show up. Now, here we see another one of those hockey stick graphs, world population. This is water use. You see that going up? U.S. energy use. Now, we talk about the petroleum age as, ending the coal age. But the coal age doesn't really end. It just gets added to by the use of petroleum. And in the same way, you can see nuclear here initially started, but it's flattened out in recent years. But always, this huge exponential increase in energy consumption. Now, you can't have infinite growth in a finite system. This is, you can argue that we maybe have more time, but, there are limits to this. Unless we decide that we're going to go off planet, we are going to have a finite system that we have to deal with, which leads us to some other views of the future. Now, the Mad Max view of the future is very dystopian. And this says, okay, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. We're going to have this, life that's solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes said. And this really appeals to people who are less invested in the status quo, but tend to be very individualistic. These are the folks that are buying their compound out in the thing. They're putting electrified fence, and they've got the canned goods stored in the basement, and they've got lots of weapons, and they're ready for what comes. But it's sort of right-wing anti-establishment, as opposed to the one that I think is most prominent in Arcata, Hobbiton. Now, Hobbiton says, it's kind of like, okay, it's going to be dystopian for a while, but then it's going to be really cool, right? Because corporations are all going to disappear, and we will all go down to the plaza and wearing our homespun in our carts pulled by horses and trade goods with each other, and everything's going to be wonderful. Now, this is also appealing to people who are not invested in the status quo, but tend to be more communal. So this is sort of the left-wing fantasy of what the future is going to be like. Now, there's one more, and that's the rapture. Now, online you can find, there's one that's called Rapture Ready website, and it has the rapture clock that says how many minutes before midnight it is in terms of when the rapture is coming. And they look at world events, and they sort of put the clocks, kind of like the nuclear clock, back or forward on this. And the idea behind this is actually a very specific strain of evangelical Christianity that's called pre-dispensational millennialism. And it says that the faithful will be raptured up to heaven, and the rest of us behind will have to suffer what they call the tribulations, which is war and famine and all those problems, until there's an ultimate battle between the forces of Christ and the forces of the Antichrist, and that will be the end of history. Now, this, again, is a relatively small number of people nationally who espouse this, probably maybe somewhat just shy of 20%, but they're very prominent in the Republican Party. And so it really does have policy implications. James Watt, who was Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, was asked in a congressional hearing, isn't it important to preserve the wilderness for future generations? And he said, I don't know how many generations we have before Jesus returns, so that's not necessarily high on the agenda. So this is a significant political view as well. Now, as I said, the problem with predictions is they involve the future. Look at this quote from Paul Ehrlich in The Population Bomb in 1960. Now, what Paul did not consider, kind of similar to Thomas Malthus, was the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution of hybridized crops, insecticides, fertilizers, mechanized agriculture managed to expand food supplies that got beyond this. But of course, then you have these sorts of charges that come up against, whenever you talk about population problems, people will say, well, remember Paul Ehrlich, he said that this was going to happen, and it didn't. And so, of course, this is the hazards that you have of specific predictions. Now, had we not had the environmental movement, we would probably have an environment today that is much like the industrial areas of China, but it probably wouldn't have been the end of the world. And so this one was a little bit more specific. You got to be careful about those specific predictions, because they'll come around to bite you. Now, those people who point out what's going on with these issues in our environment and in our world today are often called Cassandras. And of course, Cassandra was a Trojan prophetess who was pursued by Apollo and turned him down. And so Apollo cursed her by giving her the gift of prophecy, but also making sure that no one would ever believe her. And, you know, when you have someone say that bad things may be coming ahead, they're frequently called a Cassandra. And, you know, the problem with the Cassandra dilemma is you try to point out these things, but it's too depressing for people to listen to, and so they don't want to listen to it. And, you know, they may actually sort of blame the person that's predicted that when it actually happens in the end. And, you know, I get called a Cassandra a lot. And I'm sure probably some of you do as well. And of course, what people forget is that if the Trojans had listened to Cassandra when she warned them not to let the horse in, they probably would have been a lot better off. So, you know, this is the challenge that you have of pointing out this bad news and having resistance. It's all very well for you in the wealthy countries to tell us we have to do this. But, you know, you've got it. You're saying we are going to keep what we have and not grow, and you guys can't even get to where we are. So that's one issue. Transition is going to be pricey. And now, it's all a question of how important it is. And of course, you know, if you need to do it, you're going to need to do it. But it's easy to sort of put it off into the future and say, not yet. And a healthy economy requires that we keep consuming. And this one at the bottom is really important. You know, at the lecture that Larry was talking about, the Shaw Memorial Lecture, we had the chief administrative officer from the county who was saying, you know, we'd like to do this, but we have no money. And we had plans to do this, but we have no money. So it sort of became this audience response. By the end of his speech, you know, he would just sort of open it up, and we would go, but we have no money. And that's the fact in local government, that's the fact in state government, and that's the fact in national government. So that is a real obstacle. And now it doesn't mean that we couldn't shift priorities, but at this point, the mindset is all those things would be well and good, but we can't afford them right now. So that's an economic obstacle. Now, in my particular area of study and such, looking at the political obstacles of that, there's something that's very strange in the United States, and to some degree it's spread to Australia and Canada, which is that environmental issues have become wedge issues. Your position on this issue is determined by whether or not you are a Democrat or Republican, or a liberal or a conservative in Canada. If you are a Republican, then to be a good Republican, you cannot be concerned about climate change, right? And that wedge issue aspect of this really precludes, I mean, you've got to the point where they're, you know, passing laws to make sure that everybody can continue to use incandescent light bulbs, you know. Or when the Republicans retook control of the House of Representatives, they reinstituted the use of styrofoam food containers in the House cafeteria, where previously they had changed to recycled ones. I mean, this has become a really strong, sorting political issue, and that's a big obstacle. Both state and federal governments are pretty much in policy gridlock. For example, the U.S. House of Representatives again, refused this week to hold hearings on the severe weather that's been occurring in the United States. And they said that we just don't have time to hold hearings in the Environmental Committee on that severe weather. We need to focus on the economy. The state of North Carolina passed a law that said it would be against the law for planners to consider changes in sea level rise as a result of climate change, that they are mandated to only use the historical record in terms of construction and permits in the coastal areas in North Carolina. Now that's policy gridlock. I mean, that's political sorting, and that's a huge obstacle to try to deal with. When President Obama was elected, he promised, one of his campaign promises was that he would deal with climate change, that he would pass legislation to institute a cap and trade program. Because he wanted to get his health care reform package passed first, he pulled back from supporting that. That died, and at this point is not seen as having any chance of passing in an election year. And again, just with that basic fundamental blockage on it, I don't think that we're going to see action at the national level. Now, California is taking some important steps statewide, but we're hampered again by that lack of funds that are available. So, what do we do? How do we get through this sort of situation that we have? Now, basically, our policy of trying to change how society works for most of the 20th century took what the writer David Gershon called social change 1.0. The government has two ways of making policy change. First of all, they can use sticks. They can, imagine what would happen today if President Obama said, okay, 25% of Detroit's production is going to be in electric cars. How many of you would support that? How many of you think it has a chance of happening? Okay, it's kind of an indication of how things have changed. Now, maybe you need some crisis similar to the Pearl Harbor attack in order to get that done. But government can pass laws and regulations that enforce change. You can provide financial incentives, which we call carrots. The government can provide that to individuals in tax credits. It can also provide it to states in the form of grants. But we've got to a situation now, for example, the health care reform bill includes a Medicaid provision, which says that states get free money from the federal government to expand their Medicaid programs, where they don't have to pay anything on it until 2020, and then they only have to pay 10%. And we've got half a dozen states that said, absolutely no way, we're not going to take it. So, that's the kind of, sort of knee-jerk response that we have that makes this difficult. Now, the other tool that was used was protest. And we saw a lot of successful movements, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement. The problem with this current model that we have is that the laws tend to be pretty incremental, and we need to make some more significant changes. The incentives only work when people are inclined to do it in the first place. And protests point out what's wrong, but they don't really create what's right. And the other thing, too, with regards to protests is, the powers that be have come up with very effective ways of dealing with protests. And they're able to just sort of wait it out and let it sort of spin itself out without really changing the status quo. So these tools that we used in the past are not really very well adapted for the current situation. So as Gershon says, we not only have to change the world, we have to reinvent the process by which we reinvent this. So we need to come up with a different way of achieving this because the current one is just too blocked. And it's going to have to be bottom up and not top down. The starting point for the change is going to be the individual, and it's going to be in the local communities. We change our institutions more than they change us. And especially when our institutions are pretty much, stuck in a way that they're not responsive to the pressure that we're putting on them. We need a vision of where we want to be, and I think that probably, given our select group that's here tonight, most of us have a pretty good vision of what we would like to see happen. The whole question is, how do we get there from here? And these challenges can be reinforced by government when we can get the government. Very often the government is really sympathetic to these things, but they're constrained by those economic and political forces. If they have the cover of a large number of voters who say, we support these things, we want to see this happen, that gives them the ability to actually do this. And so you can get the right laws, the right incentives, but you've got to have people that are going to give these people some cover in order to get this done. So what he says in this very interesting book is called Social Change 2.0, and again the author is David Gershon. Develop a vision of what you want to have, enlist the support and buy-in of local government and like-minded individuals, and use their status to overcome potential bureaucratic obstacles and recruit members of the community and train them in the model. The transition toolkit that you've got on the flash drive is a wonderful, wonderful model for organizing local communities to put these kind of things into place. The transition handbook, Rob Hopkins' book, the same sort of thing. Getting the buy-in from local government officials to work with you in this. It really, you don't want to say we're going to distance ourselves from government, because that's not a really sustainable way of doing this. People lose their incentives. If you don't put some real changes in policy in place, it's going to make it very difficult to do that. And as Gershon says, taking personal responsibility to make the needed changes within ourselves and our community is the foundation for changing our institutions, not the way around. So from the individual perspective to the collective, overcoming the tendency to hold on to the status quo and overcoming that denial that's in place for the idea that things are going to get, somehow they will come up with a solution to this problem without really specifically saying who they are. Now, one great term that comes from, some of you might be familiar with John Michael Greer and his writing on the Archdruid Report, who writes about these issues as well. John Michael is a scholar of Latin, and he has come up with this term, Solvitur ambulando, which literally means it is solved by walking. But basically, we'll figure it out as we go along. We don't want to say, my goal is Hobbiton. Because we don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know how our weather's going to change, or what is our food supply going to be, or what the political situation is going to be. You've got to focus on the process, even though you might have that vision, but not get so stuck in what you have to see happen in the future that you can't sort of adapt things as you go along. And we're going to, get solutions in this sort of incremental thing, and avoid that grandiose utopian view of what's going to happen in the future, because that's going to, then you get to the point where the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, that you're unable to make those incremental changes, and you'll say, no, I don't want to do incremental changes. I want the whole corporate structure to collapse so that we can then create the new world that we want to see. Not a good idea. Okay, so work at it as you go along. The other aspect of this, I think, at least to start off, is to take a no regrets approach to this. Do things that make sense anyway. Don't sell everything that you own, buy property in southern Humboldt and build a compound, right? And alienate your family and all of that. Do things that make sense anyway. So, what are you going to, essentially, I've got a cartoon that explains it far better than I could in my little slide there. You know, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? You know, there are lots of things that we can do right now that make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, even if it's not quite as dire as some people think it's going to be. And you know, so what you come up with in the conference, the connections that you make with people, the ideas that you come up with, the ideas of building, you know, improving local businesses, it's going to be beneficial even if they find dilithium crystals next year. You know, it's still going to be helpful. And to that end, there's a geologist who writes on the oil drum, which is a great website for energy issues, by name of the Oil Drum, theoildrum.com. And his name is Jeffrey Brown, and he came up with this ELP program, Economize, Localize, Produce. So I wrote him and I said, can I add an H? You know, I think it'll be a better acronym if I can add an H. And so my H is humanize, which is build community. You know, make connections with other people in you know, how could that possibly go wrong? You know, to get to know your neighbors, to you know, just make your local community stronger and make those connections. Don't overspend. You know, if it means that you're going to, you know, don't sell everything and go into debt to buy your compound in southern Humboldt. Brown, who was a geologist in Texas during the 80s when they had a huge collapse of the economy there, said he had to exist on half of his former salary. He was going to get laid off, and he went to his boss and he said, pay me half of what you were paying me before and let me keep my job. And it worked out quite well for him. So his thing is, he says, it's a good idea to think. Just think about it. Do a little mind practice and say, what would you do if your income was cut in half and the cost of food and fuel increased by 50%? You know, how would you handle that? What would you sort of say I don't need to spend on? And so to kind of have that flexibility so that you can deal with challenging economic situations. Localize. Support local industry. Right? You know, there are arguments made that this is not efficient, but supporting local industry is resilience. Right? We have a just-in-time food supply where things are scanned as they go through the check stand so we know how much milk and how much, you know, pasta and bread we're supposed to get in the grocery store. If you have a local economy, if you have local production, you've got that flexibility to deal with those disruptions that could occur. And what's the worst that could happen? You're going to have a stronger local economy. Lastly, learn new stuff yourself. Learn how to do stuff. Increase your ability to learn how to fix things in your home, right? Learn skills that may be beneficial for you in the future. John Michael Greer is a big proponent of learning how to brew beer because he likes to drink beer. So when he's giving examples, it seems like he always says, it'll be very important for people to know how to brew beer, right? So learning new skills, I mean, if you hate gardening, don't do gardening. Don't put in a big, huge garden. But if you like to do it anyway, you know, expand it a bit. Learn these things as you come. And, you know, again, what's the worst that can happen if you sort of take this approach of building stronger communities, of building in some of that backup, of preparing yourself to be able to address whatever it is that comes down the line and give you more tools to be able to solve it. So I'll leave with a couple quotes. First of all, another one from Gandhi. Almost anything you do will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. And lastly, Teddy Roosevelt said, do what you can with what you have, where you are. And I think that that's a good approach for us to take as we go through our workshops tomorrow. And thanks very much for listening.